MOT 135, Chapter 12, Part 3, again trying to summarize and trying to make it simpler form for you to understand. You don't necessarily need to know too much about the chemical composition, but just understand the function. So we start off this part with gas exchange. So in cellular respiration, which is inside the cells, that produces waste gas, carbon dioxide, and water. Blood travels into the lungs to pick up oxygen through gas exchange, and also deposits the waste of carbon dioxide to be breathed out. So that's the basics of that. Cellular respiration, remember, is different, but that produces the carbon dioxide that we breathe out. The respiratory membrane gas exchange. So that's shown on various pictures throughout the chapter. So try and use that, what it says in the chapter, and then try and picture it in the diagrams. Again, I have done some video links about basic gas exchange. Again, just to try and help you understand this concept on the basic level. This goes into quite a lot of detail. We're trying to understand about that. So figure 12.18 is important, along with many of the others, 12.19, etc., to learn about basic gas exchange. So the respiratory membrane is the area between the alveolus and the capillary wall. And that's the membrane that the gases have to go through, and I've talked about that before. It goes through the alveolar cellular wall into the capillary cellular wall, and that's the respiratory membrane gas exchange. There is also a comparison of inspired and expired air using specific values this time in figure 12.19. So now it's talking more about the numbers that we talked about earlier about atmospheric pressure and the composition of air. Talks about factors of that influence gas exchange. So things that can make gas exchange rapid or not work very well, but the concentration of gases. If someone receives oxygen administered through a mask or cannula, we can of course influence the amount of gas exchanged. Higher altitudes lowers the amount of oxygen available, therefore that influences gas exchange. The membrane surface area, pneumonia for example, or emphysema can collapse the alveoli, therefore there's not as much surface area to absorb and to release oxygen into the blood, into and out of the blood. And pneumonia contains a lot of mucus and infection, inflammation, and that makes that membrane area swell, and that makes it very hard for gases to exchange through cellular membranes, and therefore breathing becomes more difficult. Membrane thickness, excess fluid, excess mucus, it needs to be thin, but with that swelling, that's why the pneumonia affects surface area as well as the membrane thickness. That can stop gas exchange. The solubility of the gas. Gases need to dissolve in water to get into the blood. Nitrogen is one element of the air that does not diffuse because it's in normal atmosphere, it is insoluble in water. And then if you read the clinical point, which it talks about on page 480, it talks about scuba diving and how suddenly nitrogen becomes soluble in water because as we go deeper, the pressure becomes more, and because the pressure is more, suddenly nitrogen becomes soluble in water, and that is a problem for us for breathing. So it's not so much the diving down, going deeper, but coming up has to be very slow in order for us to allow for us to get rid of that nitrogen. And nitrogen is the one thing that gives us effervescence, bubbly. We do not want bubbly blood. We do not want nitrogen in our blood, so we need to breathe that out, get rid of that as much as possible into our tissues. So we need to come up. The ascent needs to be much slower in scuba diving because suddenly nitrogen plays a part, whereas normally when we're walking around, nitrogen doesn't really matter that much to us. Ventilation perfusion coupling, which means airflow must match blood flow. lung perfusion, blood flow to the alveoli, capillaries constrict or dilate depending on oxygen pressure. So we've got the lung perfusion part, which can play a part. Alveolar ventilation, again the airflow into the alveoli. The bronchioles dilate or constrict depending on carbon dioxide pressure. So lung perfusion and alveoli ventilation, these can be compensated for. So, for example, in emphysema, our alveolar ventilation is compromised. Or cirrhosis of the lungs, we can get like the scarring of the alveolar. Suddenly our alveolar ventilation is reduced, and so that one pretty much gets shut off and another alveolar has to take place. If we have large areas of alveolar ventilation, that's when we get conditions such as the emphysema really make a difference to our breathing. But we do have compensation. So compensation occurs in areas of damaged tissue, in disease states. So if we have diseased areas of the lungs, other areas of the lungs will take over for the most part. Transporting gases in the blood. Remember, this is within the blood itself, the plasma and the red blood cell. It's in plasma and plasma protein. Gas exchange basically happens in two places. The first place is systemic. That means it's between the blood and the tissues or the cells of the body. That's where some gas exchange happens. The tissues have a high concentration of carbon dioxide because of that cellular respiration. Remember, that's what they produce. They produce CO2. So it's high. So as the blood passes the tissues, the CO2 moves from the tissue into the blood. Okay, so this is how we get rid of our waste. In the blood plasma, it mixes with water to form carbonic acid, and that separates into two ions. The hydrogen ion forces the hemoglobin in the cell to release oxygen, which goes into the tissue. So it's an exchange. It literally says, here are some hydrogen ions, and the hydrogen ion, the hemoglobin says, oh, well, I'll take your hydrogen ions and I'll give you oxygen. So now the blood itself contains deoxyhemoglobin. It's low in oxygen because it's just given that up into the tissues, but it's taken the ions, so it's high in deoxyhemoglobin and bicarbonate ions, which are the waste. So now these capillaries of the blood turn into veins. They're no longer arteries, they don't contain oxygen, they now contain carbon dioxide. So now they're veins, and the veins have to go back up to the right side of the heart. The second area of exchange happens in the lungs themselves, between the alveolar and the blood. So the blood from the right side, now it's got all this waste product in it, goes up through the right side of the heart, okay, completely in the atrium and the ventricle. It then gets pumped out by that muscle through to the lungs, where it picks up oxygen. The high concentration of oxygen in the alveoli, because we've just breathed in, and remember it's lower in the blood, we don't have any oxygen right now, we need to pick some up. Again, we do that exchange. Here is my carbon dioxide for you to breathe out, and here is the oxygen that I now need to take to the tissues. So high concentrations of deoxyhemoglobin in the blood. When water and deoxyhemoglobin mix, the hydrogen ions are released to form oxyhemoglobin. So now that hemoglobin becomes oxygenated. And then the freed hydrogen ions bind to the bicarbonate ions, forming carbonic acid, which leads to carbon dioxide and water. That carbon dioxide diffuses into the alveoli and gets breathed out as a gas. So again, it's that exchange. I'm taking some oxygen because I need it to transport, and here's the waste product. Okay, so it's a little bit like your trash can pickup every week. Here's the waste, and I'll take on some new stuff to the tissues. So the summary of this, and you have to read the chapter to understand it a little bit better, but the summary of this is oxygen is transported in the blood as oxyhemoglobin. Carbon dioxide is transported in the blood as bicarbonate ions. And the cells, the red blood cells themselves, mostly carry the oxygen, and the carbon dioxide is as bicarbonate ions in both the plasma and the cells. The clinical point that it mentions in the book talks about carbon monoxide and its damages to oxygen transportation. The more hemoglobin that has to bind to monoxide means that there's less red blood cells available or hemoglobin available for oxygen. Carbon monoxide is no good to our bodies. We need the oxygen, the O2. So the more carbon monoxide takes up space in the cells, the less area we have to transport oxygen.